Most people do not walk into the chicken aisle feeling cautious. They walk in feeling efficient. Chicken is the default protein, the weeknight answer, the meal prep backup, the thing you buy when you want dinner handled without a debate. And that is exactly why this category gets away with more than most shoppers realize. The average person is not standing there asking hard questions. They are responding to packaging cues, store reputation, a sales sticker, maybe a color-coded label, and the quiet assumption that chicken is chicken. But once you slow the aisle down, once you stop looking at the comfort on the front, and start looking at the details the store is actually asking you to trust, the category changes fast. Suddenly, the pool of liquid in the tray matters. The wording matters. The difference between a low price and a padded value matters. The gap between premium branding and real transparency starts to matter a lot. So for this test, we are not pretending to run a lab, and we are not turning this into a food safety panic piece. This is a consumer trust test. A store passed only if the chicken section consistently made it easier for a normal shopper to understand what they were buying, what kind of trade-off they were making, and whether the price matched the honesty. We looked at label clarity, how much the package seemed to lean on vague reassurance instead of useful information, whether the product felt heavily commoditized or genuinely differentiated, and whether the value looked real once you got past the sticker price. That means a fail here does not mean a store is unsafe. It means the store gives buyers less clarity, weaker trust signals, or a worse honesty-to-price ratio than it should. And out of 15 grocery chains, only 4 passed. At number 15, Target. This is the classic case of a store selling confidence through environment. The lighting is cleaner, the shelves feel calmer, the branding feels curated, and that atmosphere does a lot of psychological work before you have even read a single label. The problem is that the chicken section often feels like a category imported into a polished room rather than one built around actual transparency. You get the look of control without much depth behind it. The package can feel modern, restrained, even premium adjacent, but once you go past the front-facing comfort, the information tends to narrow into the usual broad supermarket language. Not enough detail to inspire trust, not cheap enough to excuse the vagueness, not distinctive enough to reward the higher confidence the store image tries to create. This is one of the easiest places for a shopper to overrate what they are getting, simply because the store aesthetic lowers their guard. The chicken is not necessarily the worst on the board, but on a trust test, this lands last, because the setting makes the compromise easier to miss. That is a fail. At number 14, Safeway. Safeway's issue is not that it looks bad, it is that it often looks settled, established, familiar, the kind of place where people assume the category has already been figured out for them, and that is where the trouble starts. Because the chicken case can feel like a layered stack of signals without a strong center. Basic store brand options, maybe a nicer sounding tier, some language that hints at quality, some pricing that implies upgrade, but not enough clarity to tell you where the meaningful difference actually begins. This is the supermarket version of quiet confusion. Nothing screams problem, nothing forces skepticism, but the section asks you to pay attention to branding mood more than concrete buying logic. A shopper ends up reading emotional texture instead of real substance. It is chicken sold through familiarity, not precision. If you are going to charge more in parts of the case or imply a cleaner, better choice, the burden is to make the difference legible. Too often, that difference stays hazy. That does not pass. At number 13, Walmart. Walmart's strength is obvious the second you see the price. It looks like relief. It looks like practicality. It looks like the store that understands what a lot of families are trying to do right now, which is get protein into the cart without turning one ingredient into a budget event. And to be fair, low price is a real advantage. But chicken is where cheap can start pretending to be value, when it is really just volume and convenience. At Walmart, the issue is not that the chicken is cheap. The issue is that the total experience can feel aggressively generic. Big trays, basic messaging, broad reassurance, and not much sense that the store wants you to think beyond cost per pound. You can see the category logic immediately. Keep it moving, keep it familiar, keep the price doing most of the talking. But chicken is one of the easiest products for retained water, processing shortcuts, and plain old ambiguity to hide inside a good-looking deal. When a tray looks swollen with liquid under plastic, when the label does not help the shopper understand much beyond the minimum, when the value is mostly a math illusion driven by quantity, the low price stops feeling like a win and starts feeling like a stripped-down transaction. For pure budget access, Walmart matters. For trust, it fails. At number 12, Meijer. Meijer sits in one of the trickiest spots in this ranking because it is rarely offensive enough to trigger suspicion and rarely clear enough to earn real confidence. This is middle-lane chicken in a middle-lane retail environment, and that can fool people into assuming balance. But neutral is not the same thing as transparent. The section often gives you the sense that you are looking at ordinary supermarket chicken dressed in just enough orderliness to avoid scrutiny. Nothing looks dramatic. Nothing looks especially manipulative. But that is the problem. The category drifts by on normalcy. And normalcy is not a standard. If a shopper cannot quickly tell what is meaningfully better, what is just package theater, and whether the higher price on one tray actually maps to a more trustworthy product, the store has not done enough. Chicken is too common a purchase for the whole decision to rest on shrug-level confidence. Meijer does not collapse under some giant scandal in this test. It just never breaks out of the fog. And in a category built on habit, fog is expensive. That is a fail. At number 11, Publix. Publix has a reputation advantage, and reputation can be dangerous when it starts doing work that the label should be doing instead. A lot of shoppers walk into Publix expecting the chicken to be a level above the average chain simply because the entire store experience is designed to feel more service-oriented, more polished, more dependable, and sometimes the chicken pricing absolutely leans into that expectation. But reputation is not a substitute for clarity. When a store asks you to pay a little more, the product needs to feel like it is rewarding careful buyers, not just loyal ones. Publix can create a very comfortable buying environment, but comfort is not the same as evidence. You are still looking at a category where branding language can outpace actual decision-useful detail, where a premium shelf mood can raise assumptions faster than the package earns them, and where some shoppers end up paying for store trust more than chicken trust. This is where the category starts to reveal one of its biggest secrets. Better merchandising can hide mediocre buying logic. Publix does not fail because it looks cheap. It fails because it can make average feel elevated, without enough hard reasons to back that feeling up. At number 10, Kroger. Kroger's chicken section often reflects the problem of scale more than the problem of quality. There are usually enough options to make the category feel broad, maybe even empowering, but that abundance can work against the shopper. Too many tiers, too many lightly differentiated lines, too many labels that sound like they should mean more than they do. The result is not empowerment. It is friction disguised as choice. One tray gives you a cleaner feeling, another gives you a better price, another hints at better standards. Another just sits there with the same familiar supermarket language and dares you to tell the difference quickly. This is where the chicken aisle stops being a food section and starts acting like a small branding maze. And most people do not have the time, patience, or label fluency to navigate a maze while grabbing ingredients after work. That matters because the more complicated the shelf becomes, the easier it is for weak options to hide next to stronger ones under the umbrella of store trust. Kroger is not the worst because it is reckless. It is the worst kind of average, broad enough to look competitive, unclear enough to leave the shopper doing extra labor. That is still a fail. And before we go further, this is the point where the pattern starts becoming obvious. The lower half of this ranking is not full of stores that necessarily look bad. It is full of stores that count on the fact that most people will not slow down long enough to separate convenience from clarity. Chicken is not being sold as a carefully understood product. It is being sold as a familiar one. That is the trap. At number 9, Aldi. Aldi gets credit for something most stores never even attempt, and that is stripping away a lot of unnecessary retail theater. The store does not try to charm you into spending more time than you need to. It does not bury the decision inside endless variety. And that simplicity is refreshing. The problem is that simplicity can turn into thinness if the product itself does not offer much transparency, beyond price efficiency. Aldi's chicken often benefits from the store's no-frills identity. Shoppers assume that because the packaging is plain and the prices are lower, the product must also be more honest. But plain packaging is not automatically transparent packaging. A basic look can still carry basic information. A lower price can still hide weak clarity. And when the category leans mostly on the store's overall reputation for smart savings, the chicken itself can get a free pass it has not fully earned. This is one of the closest fails in the ranking, because Aldi does remove some of the fake premium noise that hurts other chains. But removing noise is not the same as creating real confidence. If the shopper still has to make too many assumptions, it does not pass. At number 8, Sam's Club. Bulk buying changes the psychology of chicken fast. You are not just buying dinner now. You are buying efficiency, freezer security, family scale, maybe even the feeling that you beat the system by purchasing more at once. And that is exactly why bulk chicken needs a tougher standard, not an easier one. At Sam's Club, the value story is strong enough to drown out almost everything else. Huge trays, big numbers, cost per pound logic, the visual language of abundance. But abundance is not automatically a better buy. In fact, big packs can make weak transparency easier to ignore, because the shopper becomes focused on total volume instead of the quality of the information. Once a product enters the bulk zone, the store can start selling economics as a substitute for clarity. And chicken is one of the easiest categories for that to work in. The tray looks like a deal. The cart feels fuller. The decision feels responsible. But if the label is still giving you broad supermarket-level confidence instead of real detail, you are just buying more uncertainty at once. Sam's Club is useful. For a lot of households, it may be necessary. But on this test, it still fails. At number 7, Lidl. Lidl's chicken section has some of the same surface strengths people like about Aldi. Less retail drama, less decorative premium language, more of a stripped-down shopping mood. That helps. It absolutely helps. The problem is that a simpler shelf can still leave the product itself underexplained. There is a certain kind of low-cost grocery confidence that says, we are not pretending to be fancy, therefore you can trust us more. But trust does not come from refusing to perform premium. Trust comes from giving the buyer enough useful information to understand the trade-off clearly. Lidl often feels closer to honest than many mainstream chains, but not quite all the way there. The category can still rely too heavily on the shopper projecting discipline onto the store. In other words, the brand identity of the retailer does some heavy lifting the chicken has not fully earned on its own. That is why Lidl lands slightly above the bulk value tier but still below the cutoff. Cleaner vibe, better restraint, not enough to pass. At number 6, H-E-B. This one will annoy some people because H-E-B has one of the strongest reputations of any grocery chain in the country. And in many categories, that reputation is earned. But that is what makes this ranking tricky. A great store does not automatically create a great chicken case. H-E-B often does a better job than average at making the category feel organized and intentional. The problem is that the strength of the store can tempt the shopper to stop auditing the product. You trust the environment, the curation, the entire retail philosophy, and suddenly, the actual tray in front of you gets less scrutiny than it should. Some options look strong, some lines feel better considered. But across the category, the trust level can still outpace the transparency level. It is not enough for the section to feel more competent. The question is whether the shopper leaves with a clearer understanding of what they paid for and why. H-E-B gets close, because the store identity is built on competence, and competence matters. But close is not pass. In a category this habitual, nearly clear still means the shopper is doing too much guesswork. So H-E-B narrowly fails. At number 5, Wegmans. Wegmans is the last store to miss the cut, and honestly, this is where the ranking stops feeling easy. Wegmans does a lot right in the emotional architecture of food retail. The chicken section usually feels better presented, better maintained, more intentionally merchandised than the average chain. That matters, because physical cues do tell shoppers something. The packages often look less chaotic. The category can feel more curated. The whole experience suggests that somebody cared. But this is also where premium grocery gets most seductive. Because when the case looks cleaner, and the store has cultural credibility, people start paying with lowered skepticism. And chicken is too ordinary a product to let atmosphere carry that much weight. Wegmans came close to passing, because it often feels like the store is trying to create a more thoughtful buying environment. but thoughtful and transparent are not identical. If the product still asks too many silent assumptions from the shopper, especially at a price that can creep upward, the store has not fully earned a pass. This is the hardest fail in the ranking, which also means everything above this point had to do something meaningfully better. So now we hit the line. 4 stores passed, not because they were perfect, not because they used the prettiest language, and not because they made the shopper feel the best. They passed because the trade-offs started looking more honest. At number 4, Sprouts. This is the first store that passed the test. And it passed because the category tends to feel more aligned with the kind of shopper who actually reads labels instead of just absorbing them. Sprouts is not budget first, and it does not pretend to be. That is important. When a store is not trying to win purely on price, it has to win on something else, and in Sprouts' better moments, that something else is cleaner category logic. The chicken section often feels like it is trying to speak to ingredient-conscious buyers, sourcing-conscious buyers, and people who want a more legible decision. That does not mean every tray is automatically superior. It means the entire shelf tends to create less confusion between image and substance. The store identity and the chicken messaging are pulling in the same direction more often than they do at lower-ranked chains. And when you pay more, at least the category more clearly admits that you are paying for a different buying framework, not just a shinier version of generic chicken. Sprouts passes because it reduces some of the trust gap. Not all of it, but enough. At number 3, Whole Foods. This is where some people will roll their eyes and say, of course the expensive store made the top 4. But price alone is not why Whole Foods passed. In fact, high price is one of the biggest reasons this store could have failed if the category did not justify itself better. The reason it passes is because the chicken case usually makes a clearer attempt to turn standards into shopping language. You may not like the cost. You may not think the premium is worth it for your household. That is fair. But on a trust test, the issue is not whether the store is cheap. It is whether the store leaves the buyer guessing too much. Whole Foods is one of the few places where the category more consistently feels like it is built for scrutiny instead of built to survive it. The shelf is not just trying to calm you down. It is trying to frame the decision. That matters. The store still asks for money, sometimes a lot of it, and that means you should still challenge the value. But clarity has value too. Whole Foods passes because it more often lets the shopper understand what kind of chicken they are paying for, instead of hiding behind generic supermarket confidence. At number 2, Trader Joe's. This is one of the biggest surprises in the ranking, because Trader Joe's wins in a way a lot of chains never even try to. It does not overwhelm you. It does not flood the category with 10 versions of the same promise. It does not create a long aisle where the shopper has to decode which tiny wording tweak is supposed to mean meaningful improvement. Trader Joe's tends to work through restraint, and in chicken, restraint is a serious advantage. The selection often feels tighter, the packaging less desperate, the retail voice less inflated. That makes the category easier to read. Not perfect, easier. And easier matters because every extra layer of branding theater creates another place for trust to leak out. Trader Joe's passes because it does something very simple and very rare. It reduces the number of ways a shopper can get manipulated. You still need to read. You still need to compare. You still need to think about whether the price makes sense for your household. But the store does not ask you to wade through nearly as much noise to make a decent call. That alone puts it ahead of most of the field. And now we get to number 1, and this is the store that best exposed the entire category for what it really is. Because the winner was not the most luxurious. It was not the most expensive. It was not the one that made the chicken feel the most morally decorated. It was Costco. And Costco takes first place because, out of all 15 stores, it came closest to offering the most honest combination of value, consistency, and understandable trade-off. This is not about claiming every Costco chicken product is automatically superior. It is about the structure of the buy. Costco tells you, very clearly, what kind of shopping decision this is. You are buying volume. You are buying a relatively restrained retail experience. You are buying a store where the economics are obvious enough that the product does not have to hide behind endless packaging personality. And in a category like chicken, that matters more than people think. The lower-ranked chains often relied on atmosphere, fragmentation, vague premium cues, or bargain psychology. Costco relies more on a straightforward exchange. You can argue with the bulk format. You can argue with whether you need that much chicken. You can prefer another store's standards. All fair, but from a pure consumer honesty perspective, Costco was the least interested in turning the category into an emotional puzzle. That is why it wins. And that is why it passes. So what is the bigger truth here? It is not that 11 stores are unusable, and 4 are perfect. It is that the chicken aisle rewards stores that can make you feel safe without actually making the decision clearer. That is the hidden split in this entire category. The worst performers were not always the cheapest. The most convincing-looking packages were not always the most trustworthy. And the strongest stores were not the ones shouting the loudest about quality. They were the ones that reduced confusion, reduced theater, and made the actual trade-off easier to see. That is what most people miss when they shop for chicken. They think the main decision is price versus quality. It is not. The real decision is clarity versus assumption. Are you buying a product you understand, or a story you recognize? Are you paying for actual difference, or just better shelf psychology? Is that family pack a smart buy, or are you just buying more uncertainty at once? Those are better questions than which label looks nicest, or which chain feels the most familiar. If you want the practical rule that came out of this ranking, here it is. Stop asking which store feels best, and start asking which store makes the trade-off easiest to see. If the tray looks swollen, the label feels vague, the pricing feels emotionally persuasive instead of logically clean, and the package gives you more mood than substance, slow down. If the category feels simpler, the information feels more usable, and the store is not making you decode 5 layers of branding just to buy chicken for dinner, that is usually a better sign. Because the biggest problem with grocery chicken is not always what is on the label. Sometimes it is how little the label has to do when the store has already sold you confidence. So now I want to hear from you. Which store do you trust most when you buy chicken? And which one have you quietly stopped trusting? If you disagree with this ranking, say it. If there is a regional chain that should have been in this test, drop it in the comments. And if you have ever gotten home, opened a package, and instantly realized the tray sold you a better story than a better product, I want to know which store did it. Because the more people compare notes on categories like this, the harder it gets for familiar branding to do all the talking.